When photographing a scene that has a large dynamic range, chances are your camera will not be capable of capturing all the brightness levels. This means you'll end up with either the highlights overexposed or the shadows underexposed, or possibly both. The solution is to take multiple images at different exposures, and for this project I've included 2 images with 2 different exposures. One that captures all the detail in the highlights and another that captures the detail in the shadows. Then you're going to learn how to merge those 2 images in GIMP to create an HDR image, which is known as a high dynamic range. So let's open up this image file here, which is 02, and it's located in your section 5 folder, and let's learn how to create an HDR image. So this file consists of those 2 layers that I mentioned. So the first image I captured to retain the detail and all the highlights, and then the second image I adjusted the exposure to get all the details in the shadows, which caused the highlights to be overexposed. So the goal is to blend the 2 layers together to have a new layer that shows all the detail in the shadows and highlights. And here is the final edit that I completed for this project. And how cool is that? I love it. So you can definitely see more detail in the shadows and the highlights. So the secret to blending and merging these layers together to create an HDR is through the use of a special type of layer mask. So let's add a layer mask by coming down here and clicking here, and you want to select grayscale copy of layer. And what that's going to do is it's going to convert your color image into grayscale, and it's going to apply it on a layer mask. The result is the highlight layer has been blended with the shadow layer below. But why did I put the layer mask on the highlights and not vice versa? Well, let's do that and see the difference. So I'm going to go ahead and right click here and disable this layer mask. I'm going to go ahead and move that layer below shadows. And then I'm going to go ahead and apply that layer mask to this layer. And they are blended together again, but they look different. This time, the shadows are really dark compared to what we had before. So I'm going to go ahead and undo this and get back to where we were originally. And notice now how the shadows are brighter and the highlights are also brighter as well. So this is a better starting point for the next phase of creating your HDR image. So the next step is to do some dodging and burning to fix the black shadows, highlights, and whites of the tonal range. And we're going to start the process by duplicating the shadows layer. So go ahead and click here, and then go ahead and double click on the name to rename it to, let's do exposure adjustment. And for this layer, we're going to make it darker to tone down the highlights and darken up the shadows a little bit. So let's use our curves tool to make that adjustment. So let's go up to colors and select curves from here. And let's go ahead and pull this down and make everything just a little bit darker. So right about there looks good. Okay, so we're now going to bring back some details from the layer below because maybe it's a little bit too dark and you want to bring back some of that detail. So the highlights to me are better than what they were before, but maybe the shadows, especially in this area, I think it's a little bit too dark. So we're going to apply a layer mask to bring back some of that detail. So let's go ahead and click here and let's apply a white layer mask. Let's grab our paintbrush tool with the letter P. Make sure you have black selected for the foreground color swatch here, and then go ahead and paint into the areas where you want to bring back some of that detail. So I'm going to do this area here, maybe over here as well, and maybe a little bit up here. So wherever you think you lost too much detail with that curves adjustment. Maybe over here a little bit as well. Actually, I'm going to undo that with Command or Control plus the letter Z because I do not want to brighten up this area as much. So I'm going to drop the opacity, which is similar to painting with gray versus pure black. And that's just going to make a small adjustment, and it's not going to make it as bright with opacity set to 100. So if you take a look at the layer mask here, you can see a little bit of gray here instead of pure black like we have over here. So I'm going to go ahead and put the opacity back to 100 so I don't forget to do that later on. All right, so what we're going to do now is a more traditional type of dodging and burning with our dodge and burn tool. So let's go ahead and grab that with Shift+D. Now, before we apply this tool, let's go ahead and grab our top layer here. We're going to right click on it and select New from Visible, and that's going to merge all the visible layers into a new layer so we can work non-destructively and apply our dodging and burning to this layer. So let's go ahead and target our highlights first. I want to go ahead and darken those up. So I'm going to select Burn, and I'm going to target midtones, and the exposure I'm going to set to right around 35. Now what I want to do is I want to slowly, gradually build up the details in this area and darken this area. So I'm going to add multiple strokes at a time, not one big stroke at a time, but multiple strokes. And that will bring out the detail slowly, and it will build depth as well, which is much better versus just one or two big strokes at a time. So you can apply this to all the areas that need to be a little bit darker, and then you can go ahead and work on your shadows and brighten them up if needed. So I'm going to go ahead and switch over to my dodge tool now, and I'm going to target the midtones again, and I'm going to go ahead and brighten up this area. That's a little bit too much, so I'm going to go ahead and undo that with Command or Control plus the letter Z. So let's try the shadows this time, and I think that's too much still. So I think I just need to adjust my exposure down to right around 10 to 12. Let's try that. I think that's a little bit too much still. I think we did a pretty good job on brightening up those shadows in the previous step that we did, but I just want them a little bit brighter. It's just going to add a little bit more depth. And over here, I think I'll go ahead and brighten this up as well. And you can adjust the dodging and burning of your image to your liking, whatever your creative vision is and whatever you think looks good to you, that's what you're going to do. So I think it took me about 20 minutes to complete this particular edit here. So you're going to spend some time on this yourself now to practice what you've learned. But there's one more thing I want to do before we finish up, and that's something that we need to talk about when it comes to HDR images that we haven't touched yet, and that is the ghosting effect. So we've talked about ghosting in a previous tutorial, but when it comes to HDR, you will create the ghosting not from the dodging and burning, but because the two or multiple images, the details in the scene do not line up completely, or exactly, I should say. So if you have a tree, it might be off a little bit compared to the previous image that you took. So what happens is when you're taking multiple exposures and you're hand holding it, you're going to take a photo of the first image at one exposure, right? And then you need to change that exposure to something else to capture the details in a different part of the tonal range. The problem is, as you're doing that, you're not going to line up exactly where you were before. So to avoid that, you can use a tripod. But even then, if the wind is blowing and moving those leaves and the branches and stuff, they're going to be in a different position when you take that second photo anyways. So another thing you can do if your camera has the feature available is to use auto exposure bracketing, and that will automatically change the exposure for you after you take your first photo. And if you shoot in continuous shooting mode, you can take two photos rapidly, one right after the other, and that's going to eliminate the elements in your scene from being out of position. Now, if there is some movement or they are out of position, that is going to create the ghosting effect because it's not lined up and it looks like a ghosting effect around those different elements or the edges of the subjects in your image. So one way we can counteract that in GIMP is to sharpen up the image. So let's go ahead and do that. You learned how to do that in a previous tutorial, but let me show you what I would do for this particular image. And what I like to do is I like to go ahead and zoom in a little bit so I can see how much ghosting I have. It's not that bad, it's off a little bit, and that causes not just the ghosting, which we really can't see in this image, but the image isn't as sharp as it could be because those details don't line up perfectly from one image to another. So I'm going to go ahead and duplicate this layer now, and I'm going to call it sharpen so I can apply that sharpening to this layer. We're going to go up to Filters, Enhance, and select High Pass. And then we just need to increase or decrease the contrast based on how much we need to sharpen the image or to minimize that ghosting as much as possible. Now it's kind of hard to see because we have a grayscale here and not the full color. So I may go a little bit higher than I actually need. And I'm going to go ahead and apply that. We're going to apply our blending mode of overlay. And let's take a look at the before and after. So it's definitely sharper than it was before. So those details look like they're aligning a little bit more than they were before. And if you over sharpen your image, that's okay. Just come into your opacity here and lower it down to tone down that sharpening. How cool is that? I love it.